evening, everybody, and welcome back to the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I am your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and let's dive right into it. So last week we were discussing the calamities, the tumultuous times of the 16th century, and tonight we're going to transition into the 17th century, which I would like to tell you gets a little bit better for the Jews, but spoiler alert, it doesn't. That being said, we see a lot of trends start to unfold. A lot of dots start to be connected in the 17th century that will pave the way ultimately for the 18th century, where we will start to see things happen like the American Revolution, like the French Revolution, like the Jewish Enlightenment, like the beginning of the Reform movement, etc. And modern Zionism and all these different isms that will come about in the world. It's really the events that we have been discussing, the events of the 17th century, that will really pave the way for all of that to play out in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. So let's dive right into it and keep discussing Jewish history. One event that I want to mention from the 16th century before we firmly move on to the 17th century is that in the middle of the 16th century, the Pope in Italy, the Pope in Rome, was Pope Paul IV, who was a vehement anti-Semite and really believed in it and put many papal bulls forward, many decrees forward from the Catholic Church in order to try and oppress, afflict, whatever word you want to use, the Jewish community within the papal state. So the papal state is something that will extend until 1870. In other words, the Pope will be in charge of the whole country of Italy until the year 1870. And at this time, in 1555, the Pope organizes the Jewish Ghetto of Rome. And all the Jews have to live in a, you imagine the Warsaw Ghetto or other ghettos that have been discussed throughout Jewish history that are a little bit more well known. Well, those conditions are exactly what you found in the Ghetto of Rome. And that will extend from 1555 until 1870. So for 300 plus years, you will have this Jewish Ghetto of Rome, and whatever Jews are left in Rome at that point will live in under such harsh conditions. So Italy has been a place that there's certain parts of Italy that were not under control of the papal state, where the Jews had done quite well, but the places under the control of the papal state, we'll see now that the pontiff will start to, because of his anti-Semitic tendencies, will start to make it very difficult for those Jews. One such place is a port city by the name of Ancona. Ancona was a port cities in antiquity where the main or the only mode of transportation for commerce was the sea. So port cities were places of great commerce, and naturally, quite often, that's where Jews would go to build their businesses. What happens in Ancona, which becomes a major port city, a major place for business, there were Jews who start to have a certain amount of success there, and a lot of, or if not most of the Jews in Italy at this time are the exiles of Spain. They're the people who had run away from the expulsion of Spain, and many of them, when they were in Spain, were Marranos, were conversos, were people who had outwardly converted to Catholicism, but to save their neck, remained Jewish on the inside. And they thought once they come to Italy that they were out of the clutches of the Inquisition. Well, Pope Paul is going to prove them wrong, because we're going to see that not only does he set up this Jewish ghetto, but he has upwards of 50 Jews in the city of Ancona who in Spain were conversos, but thinking they were out of the clutches of the Inquisition, they had reverted back to mainstream Judaism. Well, the Pope finds out about this, and he has them arrested, and basically the reaches of the Inquisition at this point come to Italy. And out of those 50 Jews that are arrested, about 25 are burnt at the stake, about 25 are sent into exile. They're supposed to go to prison in a prison called Malta, which is like an island prison, but interestingly, the ship that was hired to take those prisoners to Malta was a Jewish ship, and those prisoners disappeared. They never made it to the jail. We don't know what happened to them. But what's more important from this situation is the culture that develops for the Jews who had escaped Spain. Because with the death of Pope Paul, we go on to Pope Pius V, who's no better. He really carries the torch of anti-Semitism, and he will actually expel the Jews from the entirety of the papal state for the most part. So what this did is it set a terror into ex-conversos everywhere. In other words, Jews that had converted to Catholicism externally in Spain, but had thought they were safe from the Spanish Inquisition, and therefore, and wherever they had gone, like Italy in this case, they reverted back to being Jewish. But it made them scared no matter where they were, because they saw from these actions, essentially, that the Inquisition was everywhere. It wasn't just in Spain, it wasn't just in Portugal, it was going to be essentially in every country that was connected to the Catholic Church. And therefore, these Jews become petrified everywhere, not only in Europe, but at this point, as we discussed before, we already have Europeans in South America. This is after Christopher Columbus, this is after the Nina Pinta and Santa Maria, and as we discussed then, we said that whether or not Columbus himself was Jewish, was a descendant of converso Jews, we know there were Jews on those ships, and we know that there were already Jews in South America this time. That the original Jews in America are South American Jews, or Spanish Jews, or Sephardi Jews, or exiles from Spain. And that's why when in South America and in North America, the first shuls that are founded are, the Spanish-Portuguese shul in Rhode Island. If you ever thought it was funny why the first shul in America was Sephardic, well, that's why, because the first Jews in America were Sephardic, were exiles from Spain. But the Jews in the parts of the New World that were controlled by Catholic countries become terrified, because essentially the Inquisition seemingly will come to South America. And therefore, even though the Jews are originally in South America, as we see the other countries start to gain a footing in the New World, we're going to see that shortly after that already in 1513, Juan Ponce de Leon, still part of the Spanish delegation, he'll start to make his way north from Central America into Florida and start to conquer conquer is the best word, conquer the southern parts of what we now call the United States. The French will start up north in areas of what we now call Canada and start making their way south. But the real force to be reckoned with in the New World at this time will, of course, be England. And England will start their first colony in the New World in Jamestown in 1607. But really, the event that we look at as the seminal event will be in 1620, when the Pilgrims come over from England and they land in Massachusetts, in an area that we call Plymouth, Massachusetts. Now, if you ever wondered why it was named Plymouth and Plymouth Rock and all that, that's because the port that the Pilgrims left in England was called Plymouth. So they named their new landing point after where they embarked from, and to give it the same name. Now the Mayflower was a very interesting situation, and it's interesting how in the psyche of America we remember that as such a formative moment, because there were only 100 people roughly that came over on the Mayflower, and only half of them will survive through the first winter, leading them to the celebration that we later call Thanksgiving. It probably wasn't called Thanksgiving then, and they probably didn't eat turkey, but it was a celebration they had together with the Native American neighbors who had been pretty hospitable to them. And but within a year, there's really only 50 pilgrims in Massachusetts, in America. But the reason why we look at that such a formative moment is because it was really an expansion of, or really the laying down of what became the British colonies, which will become the United States. They made the Mayflower Compact, which was the forerunner to the Democratic Constitution, and we look at that really as the seminal moment of what we will eventually call America, United States of America, in 1776. That we look at that in 1620 as the beginning of that moment. Now, there's no Jews on the Mayflower. They're all Puritans. All the Pilgrims are Puritans. The Puritans were actually fleeing England. The Puritans were in the process of taking over England at this point. making England a Protestant country, and Puritans are a Protestant denomination, and at that time England was still controlled by the Catholics, and therefore they were fleeing England for the same reason that the Jews were fleeing Europe. It was religious persecution, and that's why they came to the New World. Now, you would think that okay, the Puritans were being religiously persecuted in England, the Jews were being religiously persecuted in Spain. Maybe they could find common ground. No, as we mentioned last week, the early Protestants end up, led by Martin Luther, end up being far more anti-Semitic than the Catholics who even came before them. And it's going to be a long time before we see these groups start to soften up on their anti-Semitism. It'll be until the 20th century. so don't think it's happening anytime soon. So there are no Jews on the Mayflower. There's no Jews in England at this point, because at this point the Jews have been expelled from England, and we'll discuss them in a moment when they came back. But it does lay a framework of what will become America and what will become the most hospitable home to the Jewish people in the history of the exile, because eventually, especially what we have today, far outcries any experience that we have ever had anywhere in world history since leaving Israel in the year 70 of the Common Era. Now, one interesting thing to point out about these Puritans, I believe we might mention this last week, but the Puritans, part of their nature was they were biblical authenticist, and one of the things they were very into was the Hebrew language. Many of them had Hebrew names. Many of them knew Hebrew. In fact, they actually had when they were writing the Mayflower Compact and setting up their what becomes eventually the British colonies, they debated what the language should be. Because they thought they were making the promised land, the Puritan country, and therefore should the language be English, like they spoke back in England, or should it be Hebrew? And they obviously chose English, but it would have been a much different country if Hebrew had become the native language of America. So that starts in 1620. Within a year, it's only really 50 people, but they will branch out, and that'll become New England, and that'll become the British foothold in America. That'll eventually lead to the 13 colonies, which will eventually lead to the Revolutionary War in 1776 America, and we'll get to all that. But as far as the Jews are concerned, what we're going to see happen is as England starts to build the colonies, that the exiles in South America, the Spanish exiles in South America, were still running from the Inquisition because like we were saying, the Inquisition is still a problem for the Jews, and it's a problem in any country where the reaches of the Catholic Church went to. As a matter of fact, the Inquisition will not officially be disbanded until the year 1834, and the Alhambra Decree, which saw the Jews expelled from Spain, will not officially be rescinded until 1968. So Jews will not legally be allowed back in Spain even until 1968. But really until 1834. I mean, that's not that long ago if you think about it on the map of world history. Until 1834, Jews would be petrified of living in countries that were controlled by the Catholic Church. And for our purposes in the New World, countries controlled by Spain. And therefore, even though Jews initially were in South America, they thought maybe they were safe. Once they see these winds of the Inquisition coming over to the New World, and they see the British starting to set up the colonies in what we now call America, the Jews will run from South America en masse and settle in the colonies. And we'll see that even though the numbers of Jews for these next few centuries in America are going to be pretty small, they're going to be pretty formative, and there's going to be some pretty significant Jews that we'll talk about in the Revolutionary War, and we'll get to that in a few sessions. But again, we see that really starting to take shape in the 17th century. Now, the main hub of the Jews in the world at this time in the 17th century is Amsterdam. This is called the Golden Age of Amsterdam for the Jews, and we're going to see that the influence of the Jews is tremendous. The Dutch East Indian Company the Dutch East Indies Company was going to be founded by Jews, and Jews really going to be the center of the commerce that builds Amsterdam into what it is. And this is really the beginning. Now that we really have Jews throughout the world at this point. For the most part, Western Europe, with the exception of Amsterdam time is a lot of Jews have had a hard time there. We mentioned Spain, France, England. Not a lot of Jews left in those places. Germany, but in other places, Eastern Europe, Poland. There's definitely a Jewish presence in these places, and we see the concept at this time in the 17th century of international finance start, and it was really something that was created by our ancestors. Now that's it's a good thing and it's a bad thing. It's a good thing because, hey, look at how that changed the world. But it's really what contributes to the canard of anti-Semitism, of things like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that Jews control the world, Jews control finance. There's I don't want to say there's a certain amount of truth to that, but there is definitely, when you talk about it that time, it was created really out of the Jewish community. Now again, it's spread far beyond, obviously, but that's what was going on at that time. Now what's interesting is that in order for this finance to happen, we did have a halachic issue that had to be conquered. Now, when we talked about the centuries of anti-Semitism in Western Europe and the idea of usury and the Jewish moneylender, merchant of Venice, those concepts that they started from the fact that there is a prohibition in the Torah of lending money with interest. And that is a concept that was also adopted by the Christian church. So according to the Catholic Church, a Christian cannot lend money to another Christian with interest. So what they would do in the medieval times is they would have a Jew as the middleman, and that was where the concept of the Jewish moneylender came from. The Jew would be the middleman, and the Christian would lend to the Jew. And by the way, interest rates were not like they are today. Whatever, I forget what they are. I know they're creeping up now, but whatever, it's 2%, 3%, 4%. We're talking 20%, 30%, and so the Jew would have to borrow from one Christian at like 20 or 30%, and then he would lend to the Christian he needed to borrow at 40 or 50% to be able to cover his, to hedge his bet, so to speak, and that's where that unfortunate position of the Jewish moneylender came from. So we were already, because of that, involved in finance, but we had a very real problem now that this international finance community is developing, is a lot of times the lending was from Jew to Jew, which is the Torah prohibition of what we call neshech or ribis, lending money on interest. That according to the Torah, it is a Torah prohibition for a Jew to lend money to another Jew with interest. And therefore, how did this international finance community ever start? So there's a concept that's already discussed in the Talmud, Rambam, Shulchan Aruch. It was not a new concept, but it was really perfected and really used in a major way in this New World Order, and that's what we call the Heter Iska. Now, the Heter Iska essentially is a way of writing up a contract halachically, where it's never lending money with interest. Every arrangement is set up as a business deal, as an investment, and investments are not prohibited by the Torah. So therefore, it's set up as an investment. Now, you might say, okay, this sounds like one of those halachic fictions, halachic loopholes. We're just coming off of Pesach, and people like to ask that question when it comes to selling your chametz. And you hear it sometimes with an eruv, a community eruv. These are all halachic fictions, getting around the Torah, subterfuges, whatever you want to call it. No, there's really no such thing, because any time when we see a rabbinic enactment that seems to be a subterfuge, that seems to undo the Torah or go around the Torah, that's not what's going on. It's that there's a rabbinic prohibition that the rabbis give us a way to get out of. The rabbis cannot give us a way to get out of a Torah prohibition. If the Torah says something is forbidden, it's forbidden and there's no way of getting out of it. But throughout the Talmud, throughout rabbinic law, there's a number of protective measures. In other words, A is prohibited by the Torah, B is not prohibited by the Torah, but the rabbis came along to say, don't do B lest you come to do A. Now, quite often when the rabbis said that, they made a way to get around B. So in their prohibition, they put the escape clause. And that's really where the Heter Iska comes in. The Heter Iska only comes in areas where there is a rabbinic prohibition of ribis, a rabbinic prohibition of lending money with interest. And that is the case across the board. I mentioned the Eruv. A community Eruv cannot be built in a public domain. A community Eruv can only be built in what we call a Carmelis, which is it's an area that's not a public domain, not a private domain. And that's going to always be the case. Anytime you think there's a halachic subterfuge, there's a halachic fiction, whatever you want to call it, it's always going to be in the area of rabbinic law. So in other words, the rabbis created the law, and they gave you a way to maneuver around it. Now you might say, doesn't that defeat the purpose? Why they create the law in the first place? But if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Because the original rabbinic law is created as a protective law. Now, they gave you a way to circumvent the protective law, but in the process, you're still being mindful of the boundary that the protective law set up. In other words, when we are careful to, let's say, write a heter iska, when we lend money that looks like we're lending on interest rabbinically, we're being careful not to do the Torah prohibition and to only do exactly what the rabbis laid out. So it really takes care of the purpose of protecting us from not violating the Torah law, which is the whole spirit of the rabbinic law to begin with. Okay. Anyhow, so in Holland, as the community starts to develop, the international finance starts to develop, they start to rely heavily on this concept of the heter iska, because it's the beginning of international banking, of finance, of investing. This is really where it begins in the world here in the 17th century. Now, what we see is that the community of Amsterdam becomes such an influential community that we're going to see it even has an influence into some of the other European countries. There's going to be a rabbi in Amsterdam at this time by the name of Menashe ben Yisrael, who is going to be, amongst other things, going to be a prolific writer. He's going to be very focused on the concept of the redemption of the Jewish people this time, trying to bring the Jewish people back to the land of Israel, the Messianic era. He's going to write prolifically about this. It's going to be really the focus of his life, because he sees the calamities that we've been talking about the past few weeks as the harbinger for the Messianic era, and that is a big focus of his. Now, parenthetically, it does something very interesting, is in 1656, which is 360 years after the Jews were expelled from England by King Edward I, who, by the way, did it, and he did that in 1290, we talked about before, for purely financial gain, because then the king was just basically took their wealth. The crown took their property. But in 1656, at this point, this is when Oliver Cromwell is in power in England. So Oliver Cromwell is the Lord Protectorate of England. The king at this point, the crown has been temporarily disbanded, and we'll see it'll never come back to its full power that it had before. And then eventually in the 19th century, it'll be completely meaningless. Like today, at least, okay, I'm going to have British friends who are watching this who are going to write me emails and say I'm so wrong. But as an American, I just find the whole British monarchy to be the funniest thing in the world, because like the British are so like crazy about it and focus on it so much, and it's completely meaningless. It's like 100% meaningless. It means absolutely nothing. They're 100% figureheads, and for some reason the British people are still crazy about it. I don't get it, but then again, I'm not British. So anyhow, this is going to be a temporary time when Oliver Cromwell takes over and there's no monarchy, and again, he's gonna mess it up, and it's not gonna last long. But Menashe ben Yisrael gets an audience with Oliver Cromwell and petitions him not once but twice that he should let the Jews back into England. And the argument that he gives them is that based on Cromwell's own theology, that in order for the second coming to come about, the second coming of Yashka, it first requires Jews to be in every country. I don't know where Menashe ben Yisrael got that from, but Oliver Cromwell bought it, and he actually lets the Jews back into England. So here we have the middle of the 17th century. We have one country that has expelled the Jews, that we see temporarily the crown is not, the king, the monarch is not in charge. We definitely see that at this point England has moved really firmly to Protestantism, and we're going to see not only that, but the Jews are let back in, and this will be the beginning of Jews going back to England, and at least having the sizable, or at least formative presence that we've had there until this very day. Okay. With the success of the Jews in Amsterdam come some other challenges. And we'll see there are challenges that are real harbingers of what will come in later decades and centuries. In the late 16th century, early 17th century, there's a man by the name of Uriel de Costa. Now, Uriel de Costa, according to most accounts, was like we described before, his family was Marranos, that escaped from Spain to Portugal and eventually come to Amsterdam, like many of the people in Amsterdam. And when they get to Amsterdam, they come back to being Jewish. But it's a process, like for Uriel, in his case, the family was, he was born 100 years after the expulsion from Spain. And what happens with a lot of these conversos who go back to mainstream Judaism is it didn't happen right away. It wasn't like, okay, they're expelled from Spain in 1492, and by 1493 they were Jewish again. No, it is a process. Now, many of them are lost forever, I just want to point out, but the ones who come back, it was a process of decades. It wasn't a process of years. So we see with Uriel de Costa that his family does come back to Judaism, but what happens with a lot of these children and grandchildren of the original conversos is that they're ignorant, because as much as they kept the spirit of being Jewish alive and hiding, they couldn't send their kids to the Ghetto, they couldn't learn, they couldn't practice, they couldn't be part of the community, and therefore the education was essentially nil, was nothing. And for those of us who grew up in America or Israel in the 80s, this was very much what we saw with Russian Jewry when the Iron Curtain started to fall, is there were Jews who had maintained a remembrance of being Jewish during the almost decade or whatever it is, 70 years of communism in Soviet Russia, when Judaism was not allowed to be practiced openly. But that was it. They didn't know anything. They didn't know Hebrew. They knew nothing. And it's amazing, what happened in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. People like Revilio Esses and Rav Noach Weinberg Zatzal and Eshet Torah, and what they did both behind the Iron Curtain and after the Iron Curtain fell to try and educate that community. But they knew nothing, and that was kind of the case with these descendants of the converso Jews. When they came over and they feel like they can finally be free in a place like Amsterdam, they come back to the community and they start to practice Judaism again. Now, what's interesting about Uriel de Costa is he was an ignoramus when it came to Judaism, but he was a pretty brilliant guy beyond that. He was well learned, he knew Latin, he knew many languages, and it's interesting. He becomes very, very critical of the Catholic Church, but at the same time, he also becomes very, very critical of the Jewish community. And he's in this funny situation where he's on one hand he's speaking out against Christian theology, and on the other hand he's speaking out against Jewish theology. That's not a way to win friends and influence people, because he has no allies when he does that. Now, what's just another interesting point about him is, just before we go on to a little bit of his story, is when he was in Portugal, his name was Gabriel da Costa Fiuza, and when he converts back to Judaism, he changes his name to Uriel. So what's interesting is those are both Jewish names. They're both names traditionally of angels, Jewish angels. And this was interesting, they changed his name from one Jewish name to another, probably because we see what he was doing since he was reverting back to Judaism. We mentioned before how the throes of the Inquisition were far and wide, and therefore he wants to protect his identity. He changes his name. And to his non-Jewish neighbors, he had a whole different name, Adam Romez, that he used. Okay, so this is Uriel de Costa. Now, what's interesting is he has this take. He's opposing Christian theology. He's opposing Jewish traditional Judaism. He's opposing the Talmud and the traditions that he meets in the synagogue in Amsterdam. What do you think the Jews do with them? They say, Gen gesund hey, go back to being a Gentile. Go back to being a goy. What do we need you for? If you have problems with how he practiced Judaism, don't be a Jew. Go back to what you were before. Go back to being a converso. Get out of our community. And they excommunicate him. They put him into something called cherem, which is the Hebrew term for excommunication. And what's it's interesting that we see the institution of cherem, of excommunication, has been around for a very long time. Now, there's some times when it is very valid and should be used and is still used. For example, when we have the issue of the aguna issue, the issue of a man who will not give his wife a get, will not divorce his wife. So that's a place where excommunication should be used. A man, a recalcitrant husband who will not give his wife a get, will not give her Jewish divorce when she requests it, he should be excommunicated from the community. He should be using religion as an abusive tactic is never okay, and that's where excommunication works. But in many centuries before, excommunication was used in situations like Uriel de Casta. It was used for philosophical reasons. That there were philosophical differences, and the response to those philosophical differences that were being promoted or promulgated was to excommunicate the person who was promoting the heretical ideas. The problem with that, as we talked about last week with Martin Luther and the Catholic Church, is once you excommunicate someone, you've basically just given him an audience, right? Because what happens is you'll excommunicate someone, and all of a sudden, people say, why is this person excommunicated? And they'll start to listen, and all the disgruntled people will rally around them. And quite often you can start a movement, and the whole purpose of why you originally excommunicated them is totally undone, because you essentially promoted the philosophies that were excommunicated in the first place, and you make a whole new movement, and it almost never works. It almost works to serve the excommunicated more than the general community that's trying to protect the tradition and the philosophies. I always say that one of the ways I'm going to really make in this world is I'm going to write a book and make sure to have the book put into cherem, because then I know it'll sell out, it'll sell for hundreds of dollars, it'll be a great book. If I just write a book and it goes on the bookshelf, who knows? But if I can write a controversial book and get it excommunicated, then I made it. Just kidding. But there's something to the concept. So Uriel de Casta gets excommunicated. Now, initially, there's no revolution, no movement that rallies around him. He wanders around trying to find a place to go. Like we said, the Catholics don't want him, the Jews don't want him. So after several years of wandering around and just really feeling completely isolated, he basically comes back to the Jewish community with his tail between his legs, and he says, okay, you're right, I'll be a good boy, I'll keep my mouth shut, I'll practice traditional Judaism, and just let me back in the community because I can't take this isolation anymore. Now, you can think about that also. Like, this guy's spent years professing these heretical ideas, and but now I'll be a good boy. Like, what are you going to do? But the community does let him back in, and he actually is a good boy for a few years, but eventually he starts running his mouth again and airing his grievances again, and he gets excommunicated again, and this time his revolution begins. And he really attracts everyone in the Amsterdam community with grievances, and a movement is started, and we see that this is really, if we look at this event of Uriel de Casta, this would be the beginning of what we'll eventually call Reform, Conservative, the Enlightenment, the events that we're going to talk about as they will develop really in the 19th. Well, the Enlightenment will be in the 18th century, then the Conservative, then the Reform movement in the 19th century, and eventually the Conservative movement in the 20th century. But it starts here. This is really where those concepts start, but they're not new concepts, because if you've been following this series from the beginning, you know that really in every generation we have this. We had this in the times of the prophets. There were those who didn't want to listen to the prophets. We had this in the times of the rabbis with the Sadducees. We had this with the Karaites that we discussed before. We say in the Haggadah, we just said in the Haggadah last week, we said, B'chol dor vador omdim aleinu lechalosenu. That in every generation they rise to try to destroy us. Now, that's really talking about at the simple level, the enemies of the Jewish people throughout history, all the attempted genocides against the Jewish people throughout history. But on a philosophical level, it's also talking about the enemy from within. B'chol dor vador omdim aleinu lechalosenu. In every generation, there are those who will rise up to challenge the authority of the Torah, the authority of the Sinaitic tradition, the authority of the tradition of the Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral tradition that has lasted now for 3,000 years. In every generation, there are challenges to it. Ela Kodesh Baruch Hu Matzilenu Miyadam. But how many of them survive? Like I always say, how many Sadducees are walking around today? How many Karaites are walking around today? How many descendants of Uriel de Casta are walking around today? They don't make it. They don't make it for more than a generation or two. So that's one thing we can take from these these episodes. But there's a intellectual descendant of DaCosta who's more famous and more well known, and that is Baruch Spinoza. Also known as Benedict Spinoza. Now, Spinoza and DaCosta probably never knew each other because DaCosta he passed away in the year 1640. And he's 1640 in Amsterdam, and then Baruch Spinoza is not born until 1632. So while they overlap for 8 years, they probably never knew each other. Even though there's a famous painting which shows a young Spinoza learning with DaCosta, learning the heretical ideas, probably never happened. But who is Baruch Spinoza? Baruch Spinoza what's interesting about Spinoza is he was a childhood genius, raised in the traditional way, knowledgeable in the Talmud, really knew Torah. And why I find that interesting is because many of these challengers throughout the generations, they don't really know the core. For example, Spinoza is considered by many to be the father of what we call biblical criticism, higher criticism, modern criticism, really the idea, just to boil a very complicated educational system down to a few sound bites, but basically it starts with the idea that the Torah is not written by Hashem, it's not written by God, chas v'shalom, it's written by man, and therefore if it's written by man, we can put a certain amount of literary analysis to it to try and better understand it, and put it through the same scrutiny that we put Shakespeare and Homer and all these other writers from antiquity. The same literary analysis we put them through, we can put the Bible through because it's just written by a man and not written by the Almighty and not divine. That's part of the basis of biblical criticism and higher criticism. It's a lot more complicated than that, but it's these people like DaCosta are the first ones to say. DaCosta really said it almost more about the Talmud. He was basically like a Sadducee or a Karaite. He was saying the rabbinical tradition wasn't valid. Spinoza takes a step further and is one of the first people on record to say the Torah was not divine. The Torah was not given by God. It was written by man, handed out by generations, and is really the beginning of what we call biblical criticism, or this idea. And unlike a lot of the latter scholars, like there's like some of the famous biblical scholars that we won't really focus on in this series because they don't have such an impact on the Jewish world after Spinoza, but they a lot of them will take an approach of just looking at the Bible and putting it through that literary analysis, whereas Spinoza actually knew the Talmud. He did know the Midrashim. He knew the Talmud. He knew the explanations that we give, which I think is fascinating because the little that I know about biblical criticism is that the majority of the questions, not all of them, but I would say the majority of the questions that I've ever seen asked by biblical critics are all asked by the Midrashim, by the Talmud, by the Rishonim, by the commentaries, by the commentaries we already have, and we give our traditional answer to it. And so it's like asked and answered. That's my thought. But for Spinoza, for whatever reason, that wasn't good enough, and he goes off and starts essentially, or he's credited with starting this modern criticism, this biblical criticism. Now, same question we can ask in a greater way that we asked Martin Luther, a little bit with DaCosta, and really, Baruch Spinoza, Benedict Spinoza, name that the world knows. He will be chastised by the church as well as by the synagogue. He will be excommunicated. And the question is if anybody would have ever known about him if he wasn't excommunicated. You go to the I think it's called the Alt Shul in Amsterdam today, and they have the log, the registry of membership from that time, and they keep it open to the name Baruch Spinoza, and it has a line drawn through it, and it's a whole thing. Like if he hadn't gotten the publicity through his excommunication, the question is if the world would have ever known about him. I don't know, but suffice it to say, in 1656, he is excommunicated from the community in Amsterdam, from the Talmud Torah congregation, and he will live the rest of his life outside of the community. Now, he'd had a very tumultuous life before this, which some people think might have led to his dissatisfaction with the Jewish community, but be it as it may, he becomes really the beginning of what we're going to call the Jewish Enlightenment, and this whole movement really away from traditional Judaism, that'll challenge Judaism at this time, similar to the way the Karaites did before, similar to the way the Sadducees did before them, etc., etc. As I said, b'chol dor vador, in every generation, omdim aleinu l'chaloseinu, they come to try and destroy the Torah, ela hakodesh baruch hu matzileinu miyadam, but we are still here observing the same Torah of Rabbi Akiva, of Hillel, of Moshe Rabbeinu, of Rashi, of Rambam. We're still doing it after all these years. Okay, so before we conclude tonight, I want to just mention one other formative person from this time for a very specific reason, and that is one of the great rabbis of this time by the name of Rav Yom Tov Lipman Heller. Now, Rav Yom Tov Lipman Heller was a disciple of the Maharal, who we talked about last week. I don't remember if we even said this about the Maharal last week, but besides being a revolutionary in the mystical side of the Torah, he was also tremendous in the revealed Torah, as we would call, and a lot of halachic responsa from the Maharal, commentaries on the Talmud from the Maharal, and Rav Yom Tov Lipa. Rav Yom Tov Lipman Heller was a student of his, and a descendant, intellectual descendant of his, and he actually had an interesting situation that in the wake of the 30 Years' War, which we mentioned between the Protestants and the Catholics, that affect the Jews in a major way, and a lot of the taxation of that came down on the Jews. And what happened is sometime after the 30 Years' War, let's say somewhere around 1648, I'm sorry, probably a little before that, probably more like 1630, I think. We see that the Habsburg Empire. Now at this point, Rav Yom Tov Lipman Heller was the rabbi of Prague, and that was part of the Habsburg Empire. And the Habsburg Empire assessed the Jewish community for 40,000 talers a year. That was a tax that was put on the Jewish community to essentially finance the 30 Years' War that they were in the wakes of at that point. And it was the job of the rabbinical leadership to decide how the tax would be collected, divvied up, who would pay for it, what would happen, and that's not a popular job to have on any day of the week. And Rav Heller worked very, very hard with the committee to render a fair approach, but unfortunately, he made too many enemies in the process, and those enemies were affluent, and those enemies went to the authorities, and they accused Rav Yom Tov Lipman Heller of being anti-Christian. And so, sure enough, when that happens, he's arrested, he's found guilty, he's sentenced to death, and eventually, some influential Jews will intercede, and they will have the death sentence communed, and he will be it'll be communed to a large fine, which will take him years to be able to take him 14 years to be able to pay, and finally, in 1643, he will get out of this situation. He will actually leave Prague for Krakow, Poland, and he will become the rabbi of Krakow, Poland, which was the city of Rav Moshe Isserles, who we discussed, I think, last week or 2 weeks ago, and that's where he'll die. But he'll look at this day as when he got the job to leave Prague for Krakow, for Poland, because Poland was more hospitable than the Habsburg Empire at that point. He'll look at that as his emancipation, and his descendants until this day will celebrate the day that he got the job, that he was able to leave Prague, as a holiday. And even though he's a great rabbi at the time, by the way, he's most known for, he wrote a commentary called the Tosfos Yontiv, which is one of the main commentaries on the Mishnah. But one of the reasons I'm mentioning it is because one of the founders of Partners Cleveland, of the organization that I run, is David Heller. And our present board chair is his father, Bill Heller. And the Heller family has been really the backbone of Partners Cleveland since its inception 8 years ago. And so they're really responsible for the beyond the Harrises who sponsor the Jewish Destiny series, but really me being here and doing what I'm doing is all because of the Hellers at this point. And therefore we are in a certain way, for those of us enjoying the Jewish Destiny series or listening to anything that Landis does or that Partners Cleveland does, we're all benefiting from the Tosfos Yom Tov, from Yom Tov Lipman Heller and his descendants, the Heller family here in Cleveland. And so therefore I thought it was very important to mention them at this point in history where they come in. Okay. Next week, God willing, we're going to get into one of the darkest times of Jewish history from the destruction of the temple until this point. It's called in Hebrew Gezeres Tach V'Tat. It's the Tach V'Tat were the Hebrew years. The secular years were 1648 and 1649, and that refers to the Cossack uprisings led by Bogdan Khmelnytsky, Yamach Shemo, and that lead to anywhere from 100,000 to 250,000 Jews being slaughtered. Very bloody genocide of Jews in the Ukraine and in Poland, and that's where we will get to next week, and how that will lead eventually to the Shabtai Tzvi debacle, the false messiah, the Shabtai Tzvi, and that's what we'll discuss in the coming weeks. While they are very depressing events sometimes, they're formative into where we are today in the Jewish world, and therefore I look forward to discussing them with you. I thank you for participating, I thank you for listening, and everyone have a great evening.